Proverbs 8, it's been several weeks since we were in Proverbs last, so I'm going to just quickly review the first part of Proverbs chapter 8, and then we're going to really pick up in verse 21 here. But we have in Proverbs 8 a contrast. Proverbs 7, we have the story of the young man that went after the adulterous woman. You had chapter 6 and even chapter 5, various warnings against the adulterous woman. Now in chapter 8, we have wisdom, and wisdom personified as a woman that is crying out to the foolish, so that she's on the top of the hill, she's at the roadside, she's at the gates of the city, she is everywhere offering wisdom to those who need it, specifically to all. It says in verses 4 and 5, and particularly to the foolish and the simple ones, so that wisdom offers what these ones need, which is prudence and understanding, this skill in living, this ability to navigate the issues and questions and challenges and temptations of life. Wisdom offers to them what they lack. And we see in verses 6 through 9 that wisdom's speech is good speech. It is true, it is righteous, it is understandable. There's a sense, or I don't want to say it's simple in the sense that it's easily understood in every case, but it is simple in the sense that any can understand it. That any that will do the work will embrace wisdom. They will find that wisdom is there and is understandable to those who seek to understand it. And wisdom in verses 10 all the way down to 21 describes its great worth. So that we see that in verse 10, wisdom is better than wealth. Verse 11, wisdom is better than treasures. And verse 12, we see that wisdom is a companion with intellectual virtues. And so that wisdom brings with her other virtues that are desirable. Wisdom is a good counselor. Verse 14 tells us that wisdom is understanding. So that if you have wisdom, you are able to understand the things of life. Wisdom is so valuable, verses 15 and 16, that it is wisdom that kings rely on to rule their nation. So that if the greatest cannot do without wisdom, how much more does the common person need it? If the greatest find wisdom worthwhile, how much more worthwhile it is for all people. Verse 18, it tells us that wisdom brings riches that last, permanent, enduring riches. And it gives a righteous wealth. It is better than her fruit, is better than gold and better than the revenue or better than silver, because it is a lasting worth. It is one which cannot be lost. It's one which is not eaten by moths. It's not one that can be stolen. It's one that can't be lost in a bad investment. Wisdom is the fruit that wisdom gives is that which remains, and it leads to eternal rewards. It leads to eternal fruit. So that wisdom, ultimately, when we live in wisdom, what wisdom gives us is unending. So that wisdom is presented to us in chapter 8 as an incredibly desirable companion. Wisdom is something that we should all long for. And then we get to verse 21, or actually verse 22, and we see not only is wisdom worthwhile and is wisdom desirable, wisdom is supreme. So it says, wisdom says, verse 22, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there was no foundations abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. while as yet he had not made the earth or the fields or the primal dust of the world. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limits so that the waters would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, and I was beside him as a master craftsman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in his inhabitant world, and my delight was with the sons of men. God has possessed wisdom, but it specifically tells us here in this chapter that she was here before creation. There's some interesting things going on here. And so it says, verse 23, I've been established from everlasting. There's some that would understand that to be she was established in eternity, but because it was established, there is a starting point. So that we would say that wisdom in this passage is not presented as necessarily eternal, having a starting point, but certainly that starting point before creation. Now, I'm going to get into, there's a lot of questions here related to this passage, and I'm going to come to that in just a minute. But some of the things that are we see right off the bat, the supremacy of wisdom is that wisdom was God's possession before creation. So that we have wisdom, and so we're talking about the supremacy of wisdom. This is not something that is late, arriving late in history. It's not something that man dug up in some way. This is that which God possessed before his creation. And then verse 23, God's eternal possession. Now, I do think, even though I just said there are some that would say that wisdom has a starting point before creation, I think what's actually being said is that wisdom is God's eternal possession. And we would understand that rightly. God is all wise. If God is eternally unchanging, that means there's never been a point in eternity where God was not all wise. He is eternally all wise. So that wisdom is God's eternal possession. Wisdom is the precursor to all of God's works. So she says, when there were no depths, I was brought forth, where there were no fountains abounding with water, before any of creation. So when we go to Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Wisdom was there before that. And wisdom was, part of what's being said here, wisdom was the necessary precursor to all God's work. Not just that wisdom was there before the works of God, or that wisdom was God's eternal possession, but that specifically wisdom was present in direct relation to the creation that was to come. So that, what to say it very simply, is God created with wisdom. Wisdom was not the instrument of his creation, but wisdom was the mode. He created wisely. That all that he was doing was wise in his creation. And so if God has had wisdom before creation, eternally, and if wisdom was active in the work of creation and in all of God's working, how much more should we desire wisdom? I mean, is this not a marvelous, glorious virtue of God? We talk about the love of God, and rightly talk about the love of God as something that we should be imitating. Scripture specifically says, be holy as I am holy. The holiness of God is presented to us as something we must imitate. The wisdom of God is also something we should be seeking to imitate. Now, just as we are not infinitely holy and we cannot be infinite in our holiness, just as we are not limitless in our love and we cannot be limitlessly loving, so we realize that the wisdom we seek after will never reach the level and caliber of God's wisdom, but that does not mean we do not pursue it. We do not seek this wisdom to imitate God's wisdom. And it says, verse 30, Then I was beside him as a master craftsman. The imagery here is that wisdom was partner in all of God's work, so that she was there when he prepared the heavens. I mean, you think about Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Or the heaven and the earth, I mean. What does that entail? And I can't begin to describe it. I mean, just to make your head ache a little bit, we're talking about an eternity in which there is no space. We recognize space as some sort of substance, if you will. Space is a created thing. And so in Genesis 1:1, God created space, as we think about it. The vast distances in which the universe is put. God created light. And I mean, we scientists study light and still do not fully understand how it operates. Wisdom was God's partner there when he created everything. She was beside him as a master craftsman. And there's that phrase master craftsman is challenging, but I think that's a good way of describing it. That's a good translation of it. There are some, I think the King James might even say, as one brought up or as a child. The picture being that wisdom was there beside God as a little child, rejoicing in all his works. And I don't think that's what's being communicated. Wisdom here is saying, I was there working. So again, God created wisely. God created by wisdom, so that all of his works show the fingerprints of his wisdom. Which, stop there for a second and thinking about what this means about what wisdom is. As we talk about wisdom and rightly talk about it as a moral question, as a moral virtue, we choose wisely between the way, away from the way of evil and for the way of righteousness, so that wisdom and folly are synonyms in Proverbs with righteousness and wickedness. And so there absolutely is a moral virtue, moral character to wisdom. But this also tells us that there is a functional, practical, if you want to say pragmatic character about wisdom. So you think about the way in which God created. And we recognize, yes, God created all things good. I would say that it was all very good is the statement that it was all morally right. But, I mean, is it theoretically possible? Is it possible that there could be an immoral way for the moon to orbit the earth? Or for a galaxy to spin? Is there an immoral way in which a black hole functions? We would say that's not a question of morality there. It's a question of practicality. How does this operate? So when wisdom says that she was there as the master craftsman so that God created wisely, it is saying as well that God created something that works and works well, that works the way it was intended to work. And this is a marvelous part of wisdom. You have something, and some of you craft, some of you do other things, and you have something in your head, and you say, I have this picture, I want to do this. And then you start working it out and putting it into practice. And so I have something in my head, I have a cut I want to make on a board. And then I go to apply that in my head and to make it a practice. And I can tell you in every single case, the cut doesn't come out the way I thought. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit off. It's not quite right. And it is God's divine wisdom that enables him to order the universe, to shape the planets, to arrange the distances, to give the force of gravity its specific force that it has, to embed in the electrons and neutrons and the protons of an atom the specific attractions to one another. Those aren't just random things. They're not just natural things in the sense they would just always be there. They are assigned an attraction to one another by God, and he assigned that specific function to them so that it all would work. And if the number's a little bit off, they've done some statistical analysis and modeling of these things. If the numbers and some of these forces are just a little bit off, the universe doesn't work at all. God in his wisdom, if you will, he had it all in his mind, and in his great wisdom, he put it all to work perfectly, exactly as he intended. So that when we're talking about wisdom, it is a practical thing to be able to rightly and work to do whatever it is that you're doing. And so there is an aspect with this wisdom that for us, it is a learned skill. It's not something, I mean, even the greatest carpenter did not, and when he was 3 years old, the first time he picked up a hammer and a chisel, suddenly carve out this masterpiece. It was a learned skill that he practiced and practiced and practiced over time so that eventually comes to the point where he can take what is in his head and put it in the carving as he intended. And so for all of us, it's a learned skill, and to have this practical fleshing out of wisdom. And so go a little bit farther with this because I'm just talking about handicrafts, hobbies, and stuff like this. This affects the way we live our life. There is wisdom in budgeting. And yes, there's more. I know there's moral components that will come into that, but there's wisdom in budgeting and learning how to budget and implementing a budget. There's wisdom in all of that. It's a skill, but it is a wise practice which shapes the way that we order and operate in our lives. There is wisdom in conversations. Communication is a learned skill. And we recognize there are some that naturally are better at it than others, but communication is something that we learn, and it's a skill that can be developed, can be honed over time to be more effective, so that the words in our head actually come out and say what we're thinking. And we take this wisdom, and it applies to every function of our life to teach us to function well. Not, Steve and I were talking earlier, and I won't go into the details of the conversation, but I'll say he was grumbling a little bit about mediocrity and how much there's just, whatever will pass is enough. Whatever we can get by with, it's okay. And part of wisdom is drives to excellence, at least the excellence we can achieve. Is again, for all of us, there are natural limits to that. But we're not simply ever saying, well, I'll just do what I can to get by in whatever issue or scenario I'm dealing with. But we're saying, I want to strive to do the best, if you will, to do what I can, because wisdom is a master craftsman. Wisdom is not a hack. She's not an amateur. She is a master at whatever she is doing. And the application of wisdom in our own life is seeking mastery in, again, whatever it is that we are striving to do. Now, I will say one other thing. I recognize as well our human limitations prevents us from being masters at everything that we have to do or that we need to do. So, all of us are drivers, or most of us are drivers, but none of us are masters at the craft. I don't think, unless is there any former race car drivers here? Okay. None of us are masters in the sense that we could be that skilled of a driver to handle a vehicle at 200 miles an hour for hours and hours and hours on end. If we're going to drive with wisdom, should we be going to race driving school? No, probably not. If you have that bent, it's fine. But we're recognizing we all have limits in what we can even strive to attain mastery in. And so some of that is there's a whole lot of issues related to this, but we look at what our natural bent is. There's a part of that. What do you like to do? What do you need to do? And those are things that say, which ones really matter that I need to learn, gain some mastery in. This happens in our professions. but it should also happen in just our daily living, that we are, to the best of our ability, becoming as expert as we can in those things that we need to be expert in, and that we're striving to do things well. And I think that's really what it would get down to is the end, is just doing things well. And then in verse 30, we see that wisdom is God's artistry. You see, craftsmanship is not, rarely is it just skill, or is it just function. The things that we would look at and say, that's true craftsmanship, are the things that are also beautiful. There's an ornateness to them. There's such an execution of them that we say that, wow, that's beautiful. And this idea of wisdom as a master craftsman, it implies that there's a certain artistry to wisdom, which I think is obvious. I mean, we look at creation, we look at the creation that we can see, and it's not just the hand of a master builder, it's the hand of a master artist who has made a creation that is astonishingly beautiful, that is just amazing in the variety of its beauty. I mean, so you think if you've done any looking at pictures of ocean creatures, you look at the things that live down by thermal vents, deep underwater. Some of them are wild looking, but some of them are really, really amazing. They're flowers in the bottom of the ocean that, up until we developed the technology for submarines, nobody would ever see. And God, in his artistry, put them there. We're constantly discovering new and astonishingly beautiful things in the universe. As our telescopes are getting more powerful, we're looking out and we're realizing this is incredible. I mean, the way these dust clouds are shaped and are forming, and the colors and the beauty of them is breathtaking. God is artistic, and wisdom is, there's an artistry to it here, that this skill seeks to do things beautifully and is God's delight. It's again when it says, I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him. Again, if God delights in wisdom, shouldn't we? If wisdom is this marvelous companion in the creation, shouldn't we desire to have wisdom? And in that way as well, we see wisdom's response. Wisdom rejoices before God, so that wisdom rejoices in the success of the creation. So that I think we might hear echoes of this. When at the end of each day, God saw what he had made, and it was good. That is wisdom's evaluation of saying, this is good. I know that doesn't sound very rejoicing in the way we say it, but there is a sense of, this is good, this is complimentary and praiseworthy. This is God's looking at his creation, and it's not an arrogance that says, and I can't even really ascribe this to God, but it's not an arrogance that is puffed up inappropriately because in thinking of how marvelous he is. All of that's true of God, but we can't read it arrogantly, but we can read it as appropriate evaluation of saying, this is good. This is a good work. This is what I intended. This is beautiful. This is functional. This is accomplishing what I designed. And wisdom says, yes, this is a good thing. It rejoices before God. Rejoices, verse 31, in the earth. Rejoices in his inhabited world. And then I'll give you the third one here. And wisdom delights humans. Wisdom is not just a divine virtue that's up there and unattainable for all. Wisdom, yes, is God's handmaiden, if you will. But wisdom is here. And wisdom rejoices in the earth that God had created. And that there is a delight present with man. So that wisdom gives delight. to the humanity God has created. And we can trace this back, and we think of that we are created in the image of God. I think part of that image bearing of God is we, in our perfect creation, enjoyed that which God enjoyed. We loved God's loves. We hated what God hated. It was only after sin that our loves and our emotions became disordered. But even still, when we walk in wisdom, especially as we as Christians are striving to grow in Christ's likeness, we find that wisdom is delightful. Probably none of you will understand this. But I'm going to say it anyway, because my first job in high school was mowing grass for a professional lawn maintenance company, and we were doing high-end yards, high-end houses, $1 million homes that we were working on. And so you've seen golf courses and ball fields and stuff with the perfectly straight lines in the yard. That's what we did every time, everywhere, and I know. As I learned to do that, it got to the point where I could do it the way it was supposed to be done. Leave a job and look in the rearview mirror of the truck and see this perfectly striped yard. And it's a satisfying and a delightful thing. And I'm guessing nobody else has looked at the yard and thought, yeah, those lines are dead straight and it's so great. So that's just me, I know. But that idea of I have done this as well as I can and executed it properly so that it looks right. And I think there can be a proper rejoicing in that and proper joy in saying, this is a job well done. There's a delight there in living wisely. And that is what wisdom gives to us. So what wisdom does is she rejoices and she gives us the ability to also rejoice in wisdom. And as we talk about this section, and maybe you noticed it as I was reading through, maybe you've read other stuff, who is wisdom? This is a big, big question. And so that some have said wisdom here is a personification of God. Some have said and read this as if wisdom was another deity that eternally exists with God. Some have read this and said, well, this is clearly God the Son. Some have said, well, this is a personification of an attribute of God. So those are the options here. Who is wisdom? Is wisdom a personification of God? And by that I mean, is this here putting God in human terms, describing God in human terms as if, God is wisdom doing all of these things. And I would say simply that it's not, because there's a difference drawn. There are two lines drawn, two characters in this. There's God creating and wisdom with him. And so that's not usually the way personifications work. If it just said that I, wisdom, created the world, I, wisdom, laid the foundations, I, wisdom, have a mighty hand, rejoice and delight and whatever, then it'd be a stronger case for personification of God. But because they're saying I was with God, even in the imagery, the poetry here, there's a distinction drawn, and so we're presented with two characters, God and wisdom. Is wisdom a supernatural, another deity, supernatural companion with God? And we would say from scriptures, no, it's not possible. Because God himself declares and repeatedly declares that he alone is God. There is no other. God is one God. And so that we cannot say that wisdom is another deity that existed in eternity alongside of God. What about God the Son? And this, I will say, is a very common understanding of this among conservative and evangelical Christians. And so there are many that say wisdom here is a personification of Jesus, of God the Son. And they would trace that. One of the major ways they argue that is from the book of Colossians, in which it says, "In him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, but in him are hidden all the riches and treasures of wisdom and knowledge." And so that they're saying, see, Christ, in Christ is all wisdom and all knowledge. Therefore, this wisdom here as a companion of God in creation, as a separate companion, that's clearly, I mean, in the poetry here, wisdom is presented as another entity present. So they would say, because Christ is the wisdom of God, in him is all the wisdom of God. He is, Corinthians tells us, he is the wisdom of God. So that they would say, well, this has to be God the Son. So that we have a Trinitarian passage in which God the Father is creating, in which God the Son, in the person of wisdom, is present with the Father. Now, I would say for a couple reasons, that's not a good interpretation. One of them is the use of the feminine. Wisdom is a she. And we have no cases in Scriptures where any member of the Godhead is referred to as she. And some will say, well, this is poetry, it's a personification. I understand all of that. But even in other poetic representations of God and personifications of God, the pronoun she and her are never used. And we find in Proverbs, throughout Proverbs, wisdom is always referred to as her. And so the other one, I think, is I think it raises problems when you say, verse 23, I have been established from everlasting. If you're speaking of Christ, we cannot say that Christ has a moment of establishment. Christ is eternal. There is no moment of beginning for him. And so I think, and those who would argue that this is God the Son, they recognize this challenge and they do address it. And so they're certainly not at all saying that God the Son has a beginning in eternity. But this is still a significant issue that I think makes it still not the best choice. I think it's very simply, and I think honestly this is the simplest explanation too, is wisdom here is the personification of the attribute of God. God certainly, as I've already said, is wise. He is infinite in his wisdom, and this is inherent to who he is. All right, so what do? Listen. Verse 32 says, now therefore listen to me, my children, for blessed are those who keep my ways. Verse 34, blessed is the man who listens to me. So we listen to wisdom because the ways of wisdom, the followers of wisdom, are blessed. Wisdom's disciples are blessed. So listen to her. Verse 33 says, hear instruction and be wise. Hear wisdom's instruction. Wisdom is a teacher. She's a diligent teacher. She is a counselor. She is a gracious and a wise counselor. Hear what she teaches. For in hearing wisdom's instruction, you will be wise. Listen to it. One author, Roy Zuck, said, because of wisdom's ancestry existing before creation, and because she witnessed the creation of the world, wisdom has unequaled authority in appealing to men to follow her. So wisdom has viewed all of human history. Wisdom has viewed all the choices of mankind. Wisdom has watched how everything plays out. Wisdom has an ability. It's still following the personification. Wisdom has the ability to look at the course choices we are making and to say, that's a bad choice. This is going to end poorly for you. Take this choice instead. It's part of what Roy Zuck is saying here, is that wisdom, because of her longevity, because of her experience, she has unequaled authority to call us to follow her. Verse 34 also says, find wisdom, for in her you find life. Excuse me, that's verse 35. Whoever finds me finds life. You want to live in the way of life? Live in wisdom. It also finds favor, divine blessing. Whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. You want to be blessed by God? Find wisdom. Wisdom teaches us that you reject wisdom and you injure your own soul. He who sins against me wrongs his own soul. I mean, you think about that, what we do to our soul, to our spirit. And rejecting wisdom, it doesn't just harm our body. That often is the case. There's deep, deep spiritual harm done. And then you hate wisdom and you love death. If you hate wisdom, then you are rejecting the way of life. You are pursuing the way of death. That's your only choice. So if this is wisdom's station, this companion before creation, if the wisdom of God, was the making of us in the first place. So what this author is directing us to is that when God created the universe, he created it in wisdom. When God created Adam, he created him in wisdom. When God created Eve, he created him in wisdom. We were made wisely. David says, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I think we can shorten that to one word and say, I am wisely made. The wisdom of God is the making of us. To turn from wisdom is nothing less than to choose our own unmaking. So to choose that, to reject wisdom, is to turn to that which is contrary to our creation, opposed to what is good for us. So again, you think about our culture and how we live and what we choose and what people promote. And our culture is driven by and for folly. And that is always destructive to the individual and ultimately to the society. As we're discussing, we're talking to others, we're seeking to call them to believe the gospel, we'll be seeking to exhort them to live wisely. We do well to remind them that we are created in wisdom. We are created to live by wisdom, and if we reject wisdom, we don't just go our own way and live happily ever after. If we reject wisdom, we go our own way, which ends in death. There is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but its end is death. And so he says, the author goes on and says, to find wisdom at any cost is nothing less than life. And then Derek Kidner gives us 3 credentials of wisdom. He says, first, wisdom is what Yahweh as creator counted primary and indispensable. And again, if God considers wisdom primary and indispensable, should not we? Second, wisdom is both older than the universe and fundamental to it. So if wisdom is at the foundation of the universe, which it is, then the universe is designed to live and operate wisely. It is fundamental to the function of the universe. It's fundamental to our own function. And it's not just functional, it's joyful. Wisdom is the spring of joy. When we live wisely, we have great joy, great delight. So again, encourage you, seek wisdom. Find it with everything you can.